Hello and welcome to Unsourced Wall. My name is Elvis, and as always, I am your host. It's been kind of a quiet week. We're heading right into summer, and that doesn't mean that there has been a drought of news at all. There's been some really funny and interesting topics and subjects that have come up recently, and I definitely want to get into some of these. First up is the news that Jason Momoa has left the Crow reboot, which he's been attached to for I think maybe 2 or 3 years. Definitely 2. Because I remember hearing about this a long time ago and thinking, my God, that sounds like the worst thing ever. Not that Jason Momoa is a bad actor. Not that I've ever been impressed by his acting. I think he's personable, and I think that he has a nice kind of good-natured aura about him. Like I said, I wasn't that into him, the things I've seen him in. But for The Crow, I think he's especially a horrible casting choice. Going back to the original comic series that the whole Crow franchise spawned from, it's very much about that vulnerable personality and aura, and I just can't see Jason Momoa being as he is physically could ever be in that position that someone like Eric from the Crow comic could have found himself in. It become unbelievable because that was very much a sort of everyman kind of physique and personality and situation. You put Jason Momoa, for all that he is, in that situation, it becomes kind of unfeasible. Especially when you put into effect the whole emotional and the whole pitiable quotient of the comic, which even the original movie, and I know people love the original movie, and I like it. I respect what it did and how it did it, and I think it's decent. Even that original movie sidestepped a lot of the emotional quotient. Not that it isn't emotional as well, even disregarding the background situations and trauma and horrors of the production of that movie. Even sidestepping that, even disregarding it, that movie still was able to pull out a very heartbreaking and sorrowful tone to it at times. It's just that the comic itself goes tenfold with respect to that in many scenes, especially in the extended edition of the comic, which came out a couple years ago, that adds in a few scenes that were cut out for the original series and original trade. It just really does hammer that home, and I don't think Jason Momoa would have been able to make those scenes work, or at least even things that were vestiges of those scenes. That's what I don't like about the idea of a Crow remake anyway, because I don't think that recreating that sense of pitifulness and patheticness, everything that really drives home the whole hollow and tearful nature of that character, of the Crow's character, would be a priority for whoever's doing it. Like I said, the original movie, it's not the best translation, it's not the best adaptation, and it does some things that I am not a fan of and that I think were kind of mistakes or really did devalue things from the comic. I think that's the best we're going to get because it was done in such a way where it had a director of a unique vision, and he was able to get away with a lot of stuff that maybe it wouldn't have had it been a more high profile production. What makes The Crow so special, at least in my eyes, the comic and like all the other series that came after it in comic form, like Curare, which I also recommend if you like the original comic. Even the special edition Curare is an amazing piece of work, but that's not something that has mass appeal or would be seen as very marketable. So I'm glad that for now both Jason Momoa is off it and that it's back in development hell, because unless there's something that really gets it going and with creative forces behind it that really want to stick to what makes the Crows so unique, then I don't really see the point, and I'd rather just not happen. But they always make remakes about everything anyway. However, speaking about actors leaving, it seems that Andrew Lincoln, who stars as Rick Grimes in The Walking Dead, will be leaving the show in an upcoming season. And what makes this interesting is that Robert Kirkman, who created the Walking Dead comic book series, has always said that if he ever wrote out or killed off Rick Grimes in the comic, that would be the ending, because the entire story is about Rick and that he's the keystone to everything. So without him, there is no story, and he would just close off the series if there is no more he could do with him. But TV shows are not comics, so they actually plan on continuing the show without him so far. And there's already been a lot of backlash against that. And I can understand why, and I agree. if there's nowhere else you can take the character, or if the character is no longer going to be available to you, then it's going to be a very hard transition from what used to be the centerpiece to all these other characters who might not be able to carry that weight, especially since the show itself has gone through a lot of changes while always keeping Rick as the focus piece of the situation. Especially in this last couple of seasons, there has been a lot of uproar against characters being shuffled off the show or being killed off the show. That makes this a lot more difficult now that those characters are no longer available anymore. That could have made the transition easier, that could have picked up the slack. I haven't seen The Walking Dead in ages, since the middle of the second season, but even then I can understand how this would be such a trial for the producers to go through, and for the fans as well, who might be in a kind of precarious situation if they do like the show, but they understand that this will create some tension that might not coalesce in the best way going forward. However, on the subject of shows that are winding down, new information has come out about Gotham's final season, with the actress for Selena Kyle, Catwoman, Cameron Bicondanova, putting on her Instagram and social media that the final season will likely be 10 episodes. The post in question mentioned that they've been renewed for 10 episodes rather than the expected 13, which most shows, and at least their half season, gets, and that's what a lot of shows like iZombie have been getting. So it was expected to be at least 13 episodes, but 10, that is kind of a shock. But it makes sense in that what we have already heard, that they had planned a 6-episode arc finale for whatever plot threads they had going about, and at 13 would have been more than enough to do that. And I think that if they plan out well, and if they do have a clear direction and endpoint that they want to head into, 10 is just as fine. Like I mentioned before, I don't expect much of the plot to actually be resolved on screen and actually be shown to the viewer. I think that even with 13, there's going to be a lot of things that we would have been told about, or that would have happened during a time skip, just to move things out. And with 10, that expectation only becomes more of a certainty. So as long as the showrunners know what they're doing, or are able to juggle things in a direction where a lot of the rushed nature of it, because even then, going from a full season to expectations of half a season to 10, working from a 6-episode script, that's going to leave a little bit more issues than expected. But that I'm completely fine with, if only because we've seen so many evidence of comic book shows that do have half seasons and that do have full seasons, which cannot handle that at all well. Meanwhile, Gotham continually has small little arcs in seasons and is able to do this whole sort of shuffle. And it makes it work season after season. So I have the fullest of faith that they're going to be able to pull this off. And even then, if they don't pull it off, at least incredibly outrageous and wild and a roller coaster ride of chaos in the good way, like the show is at its weakest points. And to top off at least the show and movie section of the news, I know that the Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse trailer has come out. I haven't seen it. I've seen a lot of people who have, and their reactions, and it seems to be all positive. I'm just not interested in this. Maybe I will, and I'll comment on it then, but so far I have no plans to see the trailer. Anyway, moving on to our one piece of incredibly interesting comic book news. We have the From Hell color preview that came out with just a few pages that shows Eddie Campbell's work on the restoration and on the colorization. And it looks pretty awful. I think that there are bits and pieces that have a lot of clever choices to them that work in a very unexpected way, and then 80% and 90% of the rest just look awful, just look like MS Paint block fillers, like where you press one section and the entire section becomes the same color. There's no real rhyme or flow to it. There's no depth to it, especially in the faces and in the backgrounds. Just solid colors, solid faces, very haphazard and very flat. It looks very flat, which is a shame because the original black and white has such a weight to the entire environment, and coloring it in just makes it feel a lot more empty, a lot less lived in, and it just really detracts a lot from it. I still had plans to purchase it because of the small little things that Eddie Campbell wants to fix in the actual drawings. Make this a definitive edition of the story. That he's even reached out to Moore for other things that maybe Moore has even wanted to change but hasn't had the opportunity to until now, with the example being of creating another appendix to the series, a small little epilogue or short story to accompany their other appendixes for From Hell. And apparently this is something that Moore has shown actual interest in. I just wish it looked better, because it does not, and it's such a shame. Although I think the best part of the colorization has to be the front cover, or at least the intro cover piece that says Master Edition, and the little portraiture. I think that's lovingly colored in. That looks so good. But the rest is just MS Paint tier autofill-in. Let's move on into what I read this week. First and foremost has to be that the final issue of the Snagglepuss miniseries by Mark Russell has come out, and it is actually a really solid finale, and this miniseries has been unsurprisingly one of Hanna-Barbera's best. And like I said before, Hanna-Barbera and DC's comics have been consistently entertaining despite some missteps and some lackluster failures. It ranks up top with a lot of their other luminaries, although Snagglepuss is quite a bit shorter at 6 issues rather than the full maxi series length of the Flintstones. And that's possibly my only criticism of this final issue, is that Snagglepuss, if anyone remembers, was initially meant to be a full maxi series at 12 issues, but then was cut down to 6. And you can definitely feel that here. There is a bit of a rush quality, I felt, to the epilogue. Not that it doesn't work, not that it doesn't stick this landing. I just felt like there was a little bit more they could have delved into, especially in the interim between the penultimate issue and this one, that you do feel that it could have been 12 issues. But if you didn't know about it, then you probably wouldn't have noticed it at all. But this is something that was definitely on my mind. This totally could have been extended and definitely developed more in 12 issues than it was in 6. Although, I'm not mad about the 6. I think that the 6 makes for hefty and substantial trade. So in the end, it's still just a great series, and if you haven't read it, I recommend it. It definitely does have such a great sense of self and humor and drama and character pathos to it that makes it such a great read. And I hope that Hanna-Barbera's next line of minis continue this level of quality. Up next was Cross Plus 100 Mimic number 2 by Christos Gage, and it is still just okay. It's not great, it's not interesting, it's not very enjoyable, it's just okay and dull and kind of boring. I still think that Christos Gage is retreading a lot of his old stories that he's already done for Cross, and that's just it. He's just kind of phoning it in because it's not even developing the characters in a way that makes it worthwhile to read. It's just there, and that's a shame for a series that had to come back after 2 or so years. If this is the best they could come up with, then that's a real lackluster and disappointing return. Both the main story and both the backup just revel in just not doing anything new, or at least anything with a twist to it, with an actual not seen before or clever twist. So it just makes this entire mini right now an exercise in futility, and I wonder what the point was, other than maybe to get back your old Cross diehards. Even then, it's probably not as interesting as they would hope either. Next up would be Justice League number 1 by Scott Snyder with art by Jim Cheung. And that has to be one of the most boring first issues I've read in a long time. And I read No Justice number 1 and Man of Steel number 1. So this is saying something about things that I have read recently. Because the bar is low, and this definitely drives it a lot lower. I have to say that Scott Snyder continues to do all the things that I've accused him of doing, and that I think are among the reasons why his work has not been able to grab me. And that's because I don't think he quite has the actual sensibility to create something that's exciting and actually charming and fun and adventurous. He's just not in his wheelhouse, because just number 1 has a lot of these moments. It starts off with these sequences that are meant to evoke wonder and mystery and danger and suspense, but all of them fall flat. It's just not handled in an interesting or exciting way, so it just works against itself, and what you're ending up with are just like a lot of these scenes and lines that just come off as completely boring. The one thing I can compare this to is the first issue for Jonathan Hickman's Avengers way back when, and probably even beat for beat kind of the same sort of writing style that Hickman would do for Avengers. And it trying to be really grandiose without putting in a lot of the reasons why we should care. And you have a lot of these blunt and superficial lines that are meant to be blunt and superficial because they're trying to evoke a comic book sort of sensibility about like, oh yes, these are these prototypical emotions and ideals that we're dealing with here through comics. Like, comics are no stranger to that, and that's one of the reasons why comics can be so impactful, because they deal with these things in such a direct way, even if you're doing it through the lens of superheroics. And that's then what Snyder is trying to do here, and it's just not working. And that's probably the best thing I can put into words. You can tell what he's trying to do. You can tell he's trying to do something that is going to be so engaging, but it doesn't engage. And in fact, I felt so tired and bored by the end. I felt like I'd read something that was longer than it actually was. It just does not work. It's nice to see some of these things he's pulling back. It feels all in service to these moments that don't work at all. So you're just wasting them for moments that are meant to be gimme moments, but just don't have the impact. And by the end of it, I'm just wondering, why should I care about this story moving forward? If it's going to be more of the same, if I'm supposed to expect more of the same, I'm not interested in the mysteries. I'm not interested in where this is going. And I just want to read more issues with this ponderous narration, with these very weightless ideas and concepts being thrown about through their dialogue that are supposed to sound cool. Anyway, I know that I mentioned the narration, and I know that narration is coming from Martian Manhunter. I just don't think it's utilized very well, and that the way it is being used just drags down the story a lot more. Although it does make me think that Scott Snyder could use Martian Manhunter in an interesting way if it wasn't being bogged down by the idea of trying to be an adventurous story. Because a lot of these lines, at least Martian Manhunter, I think, is the strongest part of this issue. Just has narration that sort of takes away from the story, and the story takes away from the narration. And it's that kind of cycle that wears it down. Moving on to possibly the last thing I read this week. It was a bit of a slow week. Man of Steel #2, which is alright. Like, my thoughts about the first issue, it's okay in a general sense, but in terms of creating a new status quo, it does feel a lot more bland than it should. It feels very bland. It doesn't really assess or demand attention. A lot of these things that it's bringing up are very rote and trite things that we've seen a billion times before. So why should we care about this new status quo change if it's nothing new? If it's nothing that's actually shaking things up. We've seen the Daily Planet be in danger of new media. We've seen giant gray-skinned alien buff monsters come down to punch Superman in the face. We've seen intrigue about Krypton's demise. We've seen all these different things, and they're all together, and it's acting like it's groundbreaking. It's getting all this attention, so that's why I'm judging it much harsher than I think a lot of people are calling for. But then you see things and headlines like Rogol Zar is the DC Universe's most terrifying villain, and by what measure? He's gray-skinned Zod / Doomsday kind of Lobo dude. That's the most generic combination I can think of different things that we've already seen attack Superman. I mean, he even rides a motorcycle and puts a scarf over his face. There's nothing new you bring to the table, either visually or plot-wise. And there's also a little bit of these annoying Bendis beats, such as Rogol Zar apparently never having heard of Superman, or that Kryptonians have survived on Earth at all, even though Superman goes out into the universe all the time to do all this crazy shit, and that Rogol Zar frequents bars apparently that know about Superman and that even have customized bottles and alcohol drinks for Superman. So how the hell does he not know that Superman exists and has existed for decades? Because this is now, retcon and rebirth Superman, who's been around for a long time. So it's a bit ridiculous. It really is. That he would have absolutely no clue about this. But it's used in such a way to have like a very auspicious moment where like, oh no, he knows now. But you have to put in the groundwork for that moment. And Bendis just uses it as an exciting moment. And that's what Bendis does. He uses all these moments and all these expected emotional responses to these moments in very obvious ways. And even when Bendis is on, when he's doing good work, I'm not saying that Man of Steel is good work. I think it's a very constructed and machine-like sort of story right now. Those are usually the qualities that push me away from even his better works. So if I had to assess Man of Steel away from my preconceived notion about Bendis, I would say that it's okay so far, but then I remember that it's just an opening mini to set up the new status quo. So you have all these things like Lois and John disappearing and Rogozar being built up and this whole thing about Krypton being built up and all these little side characters being introduced. You know, like, oh no, this is not going to end by the end of this miniseries. This miniseries is meant to like keep those around and those plot threads around for the future. So that's what really gets at me. Like everything was heading toward an ending, and this one miniseries could work as its own little story, then I would be much more lenient toward it. But then you realize all these plot threads that are boring and trite are going to be the new plot threads for quite a while, or maybe even be forgotten because that's how Bendis rolls. Anyway, so it's been a bit of a half and half week for me. There's some things that I really enjoy, and there's some things which I feel like would be more enjoyable if they were done in a completely different manner, which I understand might not be the same thing as enjoying them per se, but I'm trying to look on the bright side of things. But thankfully that's over, and we can head on into some more fabulous listener questions. Our first one is from the ever great Medea, and their question is, what is my favorite cover and best/worst use of lettering that I've seen? Now, the cover is probably the hardest question I've ever heard, mainly because as a comic book reader, you're assaulted by covers week per week, hundreds of covers coming at every which direction, especially if you take the long run into account where you have decades and decades of different covers, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of covers, then it becomes incredibly hard to pinpoint one. So if the one I'm saying right now has to be only representative of whatever comes to mind and what I've been thinking about as of now. So my favorite cover has to be OMAC number 4 from John Byrne's miniseries. And it's, if you look it up, I'll describe it right now, but it's not the most exciting cover. It's not the most thought-provoking or engaging cover. It's just a black cover with two figures in front, elderly men, women, just standing side by side, lovingly holding on to each other. And that's probably my favorite cover, just because of what it presents, what it means to the story inside it, and just that sort of emotion and wellspring it brings out in me. I know that John Byrne is a bit notorious, especially Kirby's works. I think that a lot of his works that are drawn from Kirby sources are pretty awful, especially his New Gods runs and all of these opinions he has about Kirby himself as a person and as a creator. But his OMAC miniseries really did shock me, and it still continues to shock me in just how fantastic it is. There are some things that I think don't work and that don't stand the test of time and are now seen as sort of John Byrne-isms, if you know the sort of really ridiculous and hinky stuff that he puts into his series. There are some moments of that in the OMAC mini. But other than that, I think that OMAC story is incredibly well handled and probably one of my favorite OMAC stories of all time. Not that OMAC has been in a lot of stories, but I think it does continue a good tradition of OMAC stories that are short and sweet. The original Kirby, Burns mini, Dan DiDio, and Keith Giffen's run, they're all short, they're all nice, and this definitely stands on at least a same level plane as them, where I can mention them in the same breath. And so that's my favorite cover, just because it definitely does make me emotional. It's so simple, it's just so minimalist, but not in like a terrible way, because that's the entirety of that mini-series, and that's at least my favorite one of those. And even now, I'm remembering just these emotions that I felt while reading it, and when I got to that cover, it's like, yeah, this is a great story. I remember feeling that. I remember thinking that. So definitely one of my favorite covers. And I recommend checking out the entire miniseries unless you're completely unable to handle any John Byrne-isms, because there are some in there and they're very noticeable and like, so I can't recommend it fully if you're completely pulled off John Byrne and can't handle a little bit of what crazy weirdness he puts into stories. But other than that, definitely. And for best/worst use of lettering, best has to be Dave Sims on Cerebus, just out of principle, just out of what I've seen he do with that series. It's not a series that I'm completely engrossed by. It's not my favorite series. I think I made it at least to the beginning of Chasing Yahweh before I just completely gave up. But other than that, in at least just a lettering sense, it was quite impressive. The lettering does a lot to capture the emotion and humor and definitely a lot of the dire situations throughout that series. And it's always expressive and usually and somewhat consistently creative and inventive in how it does that through the lettering, through the use of the actual dialogue, and how it definitely displays that. It uses it fully as a visual medium. Probably the only other time I've ever seen that has been through Wilt Eisner's graphic novel works like Contract with God, where it definitely takes advantage of the words as shown. They're not just simple text words. They're things in balloons being said by cartoons, so you have to make that as visually imaginative as possible. So both of those, Will Eisner's works, his graphic novels, and in Cerebus, top the list in my mind. And as for worst, I have to say Jack Kirby's Hunger Dogs. If only because there's so many typos and missing letters in it. I'm reading back, and I love that story. I think it's a great finale to the New God saga. But there are so many mistakes in the lettering, like spelling dark side as dark side, like S-I-D-E, or sentences beginning on the wrong letter or missing letters throughout. And it's like, who okayed this? Who okayed this lettering? Please, who did this? I need to know so I can hopefully implore them to wonder why they did it, how this turned out to be such a mess. So that's definitely the worst lettering I've ever seen, at least in a story that I actually like. Our second and last question comes from Norin Radical, and their question is favorite moment or character in Cosmic Marvel. Since Cosmic Marvel isn't really my forte, I'm going to have to cheat a little bit and say Mojo World. I mean, that's in space, right? That's a space Marvel thing, isn't it? Mojo World? Can I just say that? I'm going to say that. I'm going to say Mojo World and Long Shot and all that ridiculous, amazing stuff. I mean, if the Shi'ar can be Cosmic Marvel, right? Do they count? Let's be honest. The X-Men have been in space and I've had space adventures forever, so I have to say that. The spineless ones, the whole concepts of the television series and what they put all these characters through, it's just great sci-fi. It's just great alien premise and execution of some actually terrifying, if incredibly entertaining ideas and concepts. So that would have to head above most other things I've seen or heard about in terms of space Marvel stuff. But to be sure to the question, I would also have to answer the Eternals. I think that as a series, it's not as good or as interesting as the New Gods, but for Jack Kirby being able to write a space saga within Marvel on his own, that it is actually incredibly interesting, at least that original sense of stories and plot that he was building toward when he was able to write the Eternals, that later got resolved in one way or the other in some other Thor runs. But those original issues, they do have a great atmosphere to them, and that's always stuck as me. And I know that there are things like Galactus and other ideas that he's seeded out before he left for DC in the 80s that some might say are a bit more well handled than the Eternals. And just on a pure basis of writing, I can't really get into Stan Lee's writing. For the Eternals, it's all Jack, and it definitely has that same sense of grandiosity without losing actual readability that I think that he was able to master, that a lot of people who handle his concepts aren't able to quite get the grip on. So those two, Mojo World and the Eternals. Moment? Well, I guess we were all going to point to Star-Lord and Nova, right? Charging at with the Cosmic Cube, and how that stood as such a definitive moment in Cosmic Marvel for years and years. So I don't think anything's going to really top that in terms of a Cosmic Marvel moment, at least something that's been so ingrained in my own psyche. Those would be my answers to Nora Radical's question. And as always, I am completely grateful that anyone has brought in questions, and especially our regular question askers. Thank you so very much. Without you, there would probably be no show. It always makes me think, and I hope that I always answer your questions to the fullest of your satisfaction and to my capabilities. I never want to half-ass it. I'm actually recording this part after I finish recording initially, so if the quality of sound is a bit off, that's the reason why. But there is breaking news that I just couldn't wait to talk about for next week, and so I'm just going to add this in right where I finished answering the questions and before I signed off. But DC has announced 7 new launch titles. for their new Vertigo rebranding, now called DC's Vertigo. And there are 2 titles in this, which I have to say I am incredibly excited for. First off is Mark Russell is part of this Vertigo relaunch. And off the bat, Mark Russell, Vertigo, I am in. There's no doubt that would have gone immediately onto my pull list. But his series is apparently going to be about Jesus coming to Earth to learn lessons from a superhero ordered by God, apparently, to pretty much do the whole Thor thing from the original Silver Age Thor, where Odin brought Thor to Earth to learn from humanity and stuff like that, and to become more humble. So that's going to be fun. That's going to be really fun, especially considering Mark Russell's tenure with religious works such as God is Disappointing You and Apocrypha Now, which are incredibly witty and amazing takes on Bible and Bible history as well. And one of the things in the pitch, or at least the announcement, is that Jesus is going to be dealing with how Christianity has evolved in present day society. The other one is called Border Town, and that's going to be dealing with a border town being beset upon by Mexican folklorish creatures and how that impacts the racial tensions within that town. And that sounds incredibly exciting. I know I've always been a big pusher for Latino representation in comics, especially recently, especially since Marvel has done such a horrible job with it. So I have got to really support this, and hopefully they make something worth supporting, because if it's bad, I'm going to be railing against it just as hard as I've done with Marvel's incredibly awful Latino-centered stories and characters. But other than that, yeah, I'm really excited for both of these. I can't wait for them to come out, and it's really looking to be a really great and neat relaunch, especially since people were really down and out about it being solely focused on Sandman. The Sandman relaunch they're also planning. So this is a great sort of, or at least this is a very neat way of showcasing that, no, it's not going to be only about that. So yeah, now to do already recorded sign off, and see you next time. So if you have any questions, topics, or comments that you would like to hear discussed or answered on a future episode, please comment below, or find me on my Twitter at THE_SNICKMAN, with also 2 special shout out to @.mc, who did the cover art and who I'm eternally grateful for. Alright, thank you, and see you next week.